Are you an artist that's struggling with mixing greens, and perhaps your green landscapes, hills, trees, they just look flat and lifeless, or the colours look neon, artificial, and you're just really struggling with them? Well, after teaching hundreds of students to paint landscapes, I've noticed the same problems over and over with mixing greens, and it's not what you think. In this video, I'm going to show you the fundamentals of mixing greens that are vibrant, organic and natural that you can apply to your own landscape paintings, and I'm going to demonstrate it with this painting that I did of some rolling green hills. Now, before we dive into mixing greens, first of all, we've got to understand how greens behave in the landscape, especially when related to value, and value is how light or dark your subject is. This is super important no matter what colours you're painting in the landscape. And this is why I start my paintings with the darkest values first. Now the rule is we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So when we're painting colours such as greens, then this is something we really need to take into account. Now, what are the general green things that we see in the landscape? Mainly grass and trees. I would say those are the main things. Now, in terms of values, the lights and darks, they have some rules to them as well. Trees tend to be the darkest values in the landscape, so this needs to be reflected when we're mixing greens. And as you can see with this tree in the foreground, it's a pretty dark tone. I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with a little yellow ochre and some burnt sienna. Now, the other main green element in the landscape is usually the grass. Now, grass tends to be one of the more lighter values in the landscape, and you can see that if you take a reference photo of some green fields and trees and switch it to black and white. So, taking into account the value of the landscape, the trees, the grass, that's going to help us to mix the correct green and get the saturation of the green correct. Saturation being another word for chroma, or the intensity of the colour. So when I'm painting landscapes, I more think in terms of tonal value rather than colour, although thinking about colour is important and getting the saturation of the colour correct is also very important. But as long as you're getting your values correct, you can still achieve depth and distance in your paintings, even if the colour is not quite right. Now I'll just talk about some of the green mixes I've used so far in the painting. So I'm painting with oils, and the brand of paint I'm using is Blue Ridge Oils, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. You could paint a subject like this in acrylics as well. Now I'm keeping in mind that trees are the darkest values in the landscape in general. Now this scene that I'm painting here, I created from some photos I took in my local area in far north New Zealand where I live. And there's a lot of New Zealand native trees that are pretty dark in value. So for this tortora tree in the foreground, I use a combination of yellow ochre with some cadmium yellow medium, ultramarine blue, and then also a little bit of quinacridone magenta, phthalo green and some titanium white. Now the red in the quinacridone magenta is going to help balance out the green because it's opposite to green on the colour wheel. So this is one of the ways that we can make the greens look more natural by having some kind of a red element in them. This doesn't have to be quinacridone magenta, it could be an alizarin crimson or a burnt sienna or cadmium red, for example. Something that contains red is just going to help bring harmony to the greens. Now for those distant trees there on the hills, they're further away, so the green is going to be desaturated. Those green wavelengths drop out over a distance. So I can't use greens that are as saturated as they are in the foreground, otherwise it's going to bring it forward in the painting. So for this I use more yellow ochre in my mix, along with titanium white, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and also some cobalt teal and quinacridone magenta. Generally I've held off on the cadmium yellow, as this increases the saturation a little too much. So then for the grass, well first of all let's think about the grass here. So if you remember, I said that grass is generally one of the more lighter values in the landscape, so we have to take this into consideration, especially if we want to make those trees stand out. So they've got to be lighter than the trees. Now for the foreground greens here, I've used varying combinations of cadmium yellow medium, ultramarine blue, a little yellow ochre, some titanium white to lighten the value, but you also have to keep in mind that it will desaturate your green as well. And then I've also mixed in some phthalo green. Now what this does is this increases the saturation and it makes those nice rich emerald grass greens as well. So you can mix some really nice tasty greens with this colour. You'll only need a small amount of phthalo green as it has such a high tinting strength, but just a beautiful colour to mix in with an existing green. Now once you've mixed in this colour, you'll need to balance it out again with something that contains red. Usually for foreground greens I mix in a little bit of cadmium red light, but you could also use some burnt sienna or some quinacridone magenta. Now if you remember, I said that as the greens go into the distance, the colours tend to drop out, so they're nowhere near as intense. This also applies to yellows and reds as well in the landscape. But the intensity of the greens in the distance is not going to be as strong as it will be in the foreground, and we need to reflect this in the painting in order to make those greens sit back in the distance. So I've mixed a lower chroma green for those distant hills, pretty much using the same colours that I used in the foreground, however without the phthalo green and a lot more yellow ochre. Also, some of those hills in the background had warmer tones in them because they had straw coloured grass, so I also painted that in the scene here. But for distant greens, I usually start with yellow ochre, ultramarine blue and titanium white as my base, and then I'll increase the saturation by mixing in some cadmium yellow medium, cobalt teal and some quinacridone magenta, along with titanium white. If the greens are super far into the distance, then I'll literally just mix yellow ochre, ultramarine blue and titanium white and probably nothing else. That's to make sure that they really sit back in the distance. So overall, if your greens are looking a bit too artificial, a bit too neon, think about its colour opposite on the colour wheel. Think about where you want to put that green in the landscape. So if it's in the foreground, you're likely to have your most saturated greens. If it's in the distance, you'll need to desaturate it. So these are something to consider. You can desaturate your green by mixing in a colour opposite, something that contains red and also some titanium white. But keep in mind when you mix in white, it's going to make the value lighter. Now if you're still struggling with mixing greens, or perhaps you're struggling with landscape painting in general, perhaps you're having difficulty with compositions, creating the depth and distance in your paintings, or just colour mixing in general, then come and join me at my art school. Inside I've got loads of painting tutorial videos. We do a weekly live painting class. We're constantly running courses there, including the full length version of this painting as well, and you can check that out by clicking the link below. The aim of my art school is to help you by providing you with a system for painting so that you can produce repeatable results with your artwork every time. Also to help you improve your painting quickly so that they'll be good enough if you ever wanted to sell them, or just have something that you can be proud of to hang on your wall. If you'd like to join my art school, right now I'm giving away a 7-day free trial. Click the link below to join. Now then, back to the painting, and let's just talk a bit more about mixing the greens and just the painting overall. So if you remember, I started off by painting my darks first, and this allows me to create a tonal framework in the painting, and it makes it easier to then paint the areas in light. So we had our darkest darks, which was the tortura tree in the foreground, and this was a mix of yellow ochre, ultramarine blue and a bit of burnt sienna. And then as I painted the other tree shadows and shadows in the grass into the distance, those shadows are getting lighter because they're further away. The grass shadows are going to be a bit lighter than the tree shadows because if you remember, the grass is a lighter value colour than the trees, so something to keep in mind there. Now when I block in a painting, I use loose gestural brush marks and I don't think about detail at all. At this stage of the painting, I just want to get the main tonal framework down and the colours down, and then once it's dry I can work from there. The other thing I do, and this is particularly important, is to keep the values generally a little darker. so that I've got plenty of room to layer on lighter layers of paint afterwards once the painting's dry. And then I'll be building up those lighter tones as I work through the painting, and then I'll be saving my lightest values until the end of the painting. And this is what's going to really bring it to life and make the whole thing pop. So already I started off with the darker shadows in the grass, for example, and then once it was dry I was able to add lighter layers of paint, and it just builds up the depth in the painting and it helps to make the painting look more lifelike. Now this is particularly important when you're painting landscapes, if you want to create some nice depth in your paintings, especially when you're mixing greens. Now what I was doing at this stage of the painting was I was adding details, and this is a stage known as modelling, so I'm working on individual zones in the painting and starting to refine forms and shapes, things like that. But the main thing with the trees is that I kept them tonally darker, and this allowed me to add lighter layers of paint. So with the green mixes, I was generally using the same colours as I was to begin with, but I was just making them tonally a little lighter, so perhaps adding more titanium white and colours such as cadmium yellow medium. Now cadmium yellow medium is a beautiful yellow to use, and it will help to increase the saturation of your greens, but keep in mind it will make your green more yellow. So if you want to green it up again, you can mix in something like a little phthalo green and some cobalt teal. But then after that you will need to balance it out with something that contains red. Now when it comes to my painting style, I like loose gestural brushwork because I think it gives my paintings an aliveness and vitality. However, I do like a little bit of detail. On the other hand, I don't want my paintings to be overly detailed, so I like to imply detail without actually getting bogged down in the weeds with painting individual details. For example, grass. I don't want to be painting every single blade of grass, that would be a nightmare. So as you can see here, I'm just implying thick grass. Now I'm using lighter layers of paint here, and I started off with those darker layers, but it's adding more depth to the scene overall. So this is why we start a little bit darker with our colours, and then we let it dry, and then we can layer on some lighter layers of paint. And that's what I'm doing here, because I'm thinking about my lightest values, which I'm saving towards the end. Now let's talk about some of the other elements within the landscape, especially when it comes to mixing green. Another thing that's adding depth to the grass here is some of the shadows. And for the shadows, I've mainly used mixes of ultramarine blue with a little yellow ochre. And then I've also added in colours such as cobalt teal, which creates a really nice cool green. And then I've mixed in a little bit of titanium white, just to make sure that those shadows are lighter than what they would be if they were the tree shadows. So if you remember, grass is a lighter value than trees in general. There are of course exceptions to the rule. Now if I need to increase the saturation of the greens even within the shadows, then I can mix in a little bit of cadmium yellow medium. But keep in mind that these shadows are most likely to be cool shadows, so you don't want to add too much. Now at this point in the painting, I was starting to think about getting it finished and beginning to add those last details. So using a number 0 rigger brush to paint a network of branches in the trees, especially the willow trees in the midground, the tortoise in the foreground, and the poplars that are in the background. It's an interesting landscape this, because we get a lot of rain up here in far north New Zealand, and we've got a whole mix of New Zealand native trees and European trees. So the European trees had lost all their leaves at this point, but then the red in the trees here is providing a nice colour complement to the greens as well, helping to provide more balance in the landscape. Now another way to imply thick grass in the landscape is to use a bristle dagger brush and just push the paint upwards in the direction that the grass is growing. I finished up the painting by adding the lightest values, some highlights on the grass and the trees, and with that it was complete. So I hope this video helped you with mixing your greens and that it inspires you to paint some landscapes with some green rolling hills. If you'd like to learn more about mixing greens, then check out this video here. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.